sama Zoom-nya Pak
Iya,
Arik.
sebentar Mbak Eva. Sudah ada Mbak Naris? Arik penilaian. Arik.
Belum juga. Oh, nggak ada Pak. Atau Mas Dani atau yang lain ada nggak ya? Atau mungkin admit all terus jadi semuanya masuk ya? Kita masukin
Mau di
semuanya.
admit all-nya?
Ya. Oke. Kita mulai menerima semuanya ya.
Siap, siap.
Anak kambing panjat pohon kapuk. Turun dari pohon, minta dibelai. Para hadirin dipersilakan duduk karena acara akan segera dimulai.
Cakep. Terima kasih.
Ya. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Waalaikumsalam.
Selamat pagi dan salam sejahtera untuk kita semua. Shalom, Om Swastiastu, Namo Buddhaya, salam kebajikan. Yang terhormat, Direktur Jenderal Kekayaan Negara Kementerian Keuangan Republik Indonesia, Bapak Rionald Silaban, Sekretaris Direktorat Jenderal Kekayaan Negara Kementerian Keuangan, Bapak Dedi Syarif Usman, Direktur Penilaian Kementerian Keuangan, Bapak Arik Haryono, Kepala Taman Nasional Gunung Gede Pangrango, Bapak Sabto Aji Prabowo, Dosen Universitas Indonesia, Ibu Alin Halimatus Sadia, pembicara yang terhormat, Yuha Sikamaki dan Rob Smith. Selamat datang di webinar Natural Capital Identifying and Realizing the Value of Conservation Forest, atau Neraca Sumber Daya Alam, mengidentifikasi dan merealisasikan nilai hutan konservasi. Webinar ini akan membahas pentingnya menghitung nilai sumber daya alam di hutan konservasi Indonesia dan bagaimana hal tersebut dapat berkontribusi pada pembangunan berkelanjutan. Webinar ini memiliki 3 tujuan utama. Yang pertama, memfasilitasi diskusi tentang perkembangan baru dalam penilaian hutan konservasi secara internasional. Yang kedua, memahami peluang penilaian hutan konservasi di Indonesia. Yang ketiga, mengumpulkan masukan untuk menyiapkan workshop dan pelatihan lanjutan. Acara hari ini akan dibuka oleh perwakilan dari Kementerian Keuangan dan Kementerian Lingkungan Hidup dan Kehutanan, serta dilanjutkan oleh sesi presentasi dan diskusi. Sesi pertama terdiri atas 2 presentasi oleh Yuha Sikamaki dan Rob Smith. Setelah presentasi, akan ada tanggapan dan sesi tanya-jawab yang dimoderasi oleh Ibu Alin Halimatus Sadia. Setelah itu, penutupan akan disampaikan oleh Bapak Jeki Kachan, ekonom senior dari Bank Dunia. Untuk memulai acara, izinkan kami menayangkan sambutan dari Bapak Direktur Jenderal. Dan Rob Smith. Setelah presentasi, akan ada tanggapan dan sesi tanya. Untuk memulai acara, izinkan kami menayangkan sambutan dari Bapak Direktur Jenderal.
Warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Om Swastiastu, Namo Buddhaya. Greetings of excellence and may peace be with every one of us. Ladies and gentlemen, Indonesia, with just 1.2% of the world landmass, is a mega biodiversity country. housing 10% of the world's species, 12% of mammals, and about 17% of global bird species. Over 500 protected areas, including conservation forests, cover a land area exceeding 25 million hectares. Conservation forests are crucial for the environment, as it absorbs carbon dioxide, protecting wildlife and providing clean air, water, and fertile soil. Valuing forests goes beyond their physical worth. Recognizing the intangible benefits they offer, such as safeguarding biodiversity, water, soil, and capturing carbon, is crucial. Efforts are underway in international policy dialogue to understand these hidden values better. Managing conservation forests present financial opportunities like REDD+. It maximizes funding, ensures sustainability, and provide incentive for conservation. Reliable valuation methods are needed to demonstrate their true value as relevant indicators for REDD+. We must also ensure that forest management align with principles of social equity, protecting the interests of local communities and indigenous people. To accurately determine and appreciate the value of conservation forests, engaging multiple stakeholders is essential. Therefore, let us engage in a thoughtful discussion and explore ideas for future valuation. My best wishes for the success of this webinar. Thank you. Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Waalaikumsalam warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Dan selanjutnya akan ada sambutan oleh Bapak Arik Haryono, dan izinkan saya menyebut Pak Arik dengan sebuah pantun. Penilaian ekosistem adalah hal baik untuk jadikan Indonesia negara padan. Kepada yang terhormat Pak Arik, waktu dan tempat kami persilakan.
Terima kasih Mbak Nariswari. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Good morning, selamat pagi, salam sejahtera bagi semuanya. Om Swastiastu, Namo Buddhaya, salam kebajikan, salam sehat. To the Honorables, Director General of Directorate General State Asset Management, Bapak Rionald Silaban, Secretary General of DigiSams, Bapak Dedi Sarif Usman, Bapak Sabto Aji Prabowo, Head of Gunung Gede Pangrango National Parks, and today our speaker, Mr. Juha Sikamaki, Chief Economist from International Union for Conservation of Nature, and also Mr. Rob Smith, Senior Associate from International Institute for Sustainable Development and Principle, and also Mr. David, Senior Economist World Banks. Thank you. And Dr. Alin Halimatus Sadia from Universitas Indonesia, all directors from internal and external of Ministry of Finance, all head regional officer of DigiSams, all failure, and also lovely all invitees and audience in today's knowledge sharings. This morning, we will have our second webinar series in collaboration with World Bank with an important themes, identifying and realizing the value of forest conservation. Today, we present two speakers who are very expert in their fields, Rob Smith and Juha Sikamaki. Rob has previously spoken at our first webinar, and we express our highest appreciation and thank you, Rob, for agreeing to return to attend in this second webinar. Our second speaker will be Juha Sikamaki. He is the Chief Economist of the International Union for Conservation of Nature from United States, America. We hope that Our expert today will be able to provide best practice in valuing conservation forests, whether in Canada and the United States. We know that Canada is a country which is the forefront of environmental preservation. Dear ladies and gentlemen, today's topic is related to the valuing methodology of conservation forests. As stated by the Director General of Director General State Asset Management, the area of conservation forests in Indonesia exceeds 25 million hectares. The competitiveness of Indonesian natural resources is ranked 17th out of 139 countries. Forests must be protected. Why? Because they can provide health benefit for everyone. Forests can provide fresh air, nutritious food, clean water, and also recreation space. In development countries, up to 25% of all medicines are plant-based. While in developing countries, the contribution reaches 80%. So we can imagine, right? Forests must be protected because they can become a source of food for people living around the forests. Indonesia tropical forest is the third largest after Brazil and Congo. Given the importance of forests, in order to our forests to remain sustainable, we need better forest management. Government Regulation Number 46, 2017 on environmental economic instruments mandates the government to prepare in environmental economic balance. This balance is instrument to protect and preserve the environment and also record reserve of natural resources. To be able to arrange the balance, it is necessary to carry out evaluations. Valuing natural resources, in this case forest, also requires a synergy, a coordination, collaborations, and also cooperation with other ministry, agency, and also in order for the total economic value of a conservation forest to reflect the true value. We need to know best practice and the good methodology in valuing conservation forests in other countries. Like I mentioned before to David and Mbak Nariswari about this. Therefore, whenever our valuers especially value conservation forests, it is expected that the value will be in line with the methodology and also standard recognized and applied national and globally. Yes, ladies and gentlemen, this year, the Ministry of Finance has a strategic initiative program of valuation pilotings for forest natural resources for the wood account. We elaborate strategic initiative with economic ecosystem service evaluation. So that in the end, apart from getting the fiscal potential from wood stock, we will also get an overview related to the potential for the ecosystem services, namely a carbon sequestration from a forest, which can later become one of the alternative development financings, carbon trading. And the future, this will be a challenge, as well as an opportunity for DGCM valuer to develop. The challenge in conducting natural resources valuation are increasingly diverse. Therefore, it is important for us to improve the competence of within the field of natural resources valuation, especially natural resources in conservation forest. We hope that today's activities can become a means of constructive discussion and a good opportunity to increase insight and competence. Hopefully, there will be lots of input of recommendation regarding our next step that the need to be taken in optimizing our tasks and function on valuations. Finally, we would like to thank all the invitees who are eager to attend and discuss today's topics. More than 320 persons this morning already with us, and also with more knowledge, it will increase our awareness on sustainable development. Thank you. Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Waalaikumsalam warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Terima kasih banyak Pak Arik. Sambutan selanjutnya akan disampaikan oleh Kepala Taman Nasional Gunung Gede Pangrango, Bapak Sabto Aji Prabowo. Izinkan saya mengundang Pak Sabto dengan sebuah pantun lagi. Indonesia Raya negara hebat, kaya akan alam dan kebudayaan. Kepada Pak Sabto yang terhormat, waktu dan tempat kami persilakan.
Terima kasih Mbak Naris. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Yang saya hormati Pak Arik Haryono, Pak David Kajan, Bapak Ibu, serta terutama ini kolega-kolega saya, Kepala Balai Besar Taman Nasional, Kepala Balai Besar KSDA, Kepala Balai Taman Nasional, dan Kepala Balai KSDA seluruh Indonesia atau yang mewakili. Jadi saya agak kaget diminta untuk memberikan speech terkait current condition of the management of national park di Indonesia. Tapi saya akan menyampaikan dalam case untuk Taman Nasional Gunung Gede Pangrango. Jadi Gunung Gede Pangrango ini taman nasional yang relatif paling dekat dengan Jakarta dengan 278 hektar, sebagian sangat kecil dari seluruh luas kawasan konservasi di Indonesia yang mencapai 27 juta hektar. Namun demikian kita memiliki berbagai potensi, ada 110 spesies mamalia, 250 spesies burung, 300 spesies insek, kemudian 20 spesies amfibi, 5 spesies primata, dan juga 75 spesies reptiles. Selain itu juga ada potensi flora yang sangat banyak, 1.500 jenis bunga-bungaan, 120 spesies tanaman obat, kemudian juga beberapa spesies yang lain juga yang itu sangat luar biasa. Ada 3 flag juga potensi ekoturisme yang luar biasa, dan tentu ini hanya bagian kecil dari seluruh kawasan konservasi Indonesia yang tentu yang lainnya akan lebih luar biasa lagi jika kita ungkapkan. Nah, Taman Nasional Gunung Gede Pangrango juga merupakan catchment area untuk 4 das sangat penting di Jabodetabek, yaitu Das Citarum, Das Cimandiri, Das Cisadane, dan juga Das Ciliwung. Dengan produksi air yang mencapai 594 miliar liter setiap tahun, ini dihitung pada tahun 2015. Selain itu, Taman Nasional ini juga mempunyai potensi untuk panas bumi mencapai 130 megawatt energi, serta juga tentu ada potensi karbon. Nah, Bapak Ibu yang saya hormati, bahwa masih banyak potensi taman nasional, dan saya yakin apalagi di luar Jawa sana, yang belum teridentifikasi, yang belum dapat diidentifikasi dengan baik. Karena saking luasnya, juga karena beberapa hal tantangan yang terjadi dalam pengelolaan. Beberapa hal yang ingin saya sampaikan kondisi saat ini terkait pengelolaan kawasan konservasi di Indonesia adalah masih minimnya budget. Jadi budget yang digunakan untuk pengelolaan kawasan konservasi itu relatif masih kecil. Even untuk Taman Nasional Gunung Gede Pangrango yang tidak terlalu jauh dari Jakarta. Jadi rata-rata hanya di angka sekitar 2.000–3.000 rupiah per tahun per hektar. Dan sebagian besar budget itu juga masih untuk operasional rutin, gaji pegawai, pemeliharaan bangunan kendaraan, dan yang untuk pengembangan pengelolaan masih di angka 35-40%, masih sangat kecil, sehingga itu adalah salah satu tantangan. Yang kedua tentu tantangan klasik adalah jumlah sumber daya manusia. Bahkan di taman nasional yang relatif kecil seperti Gunung Gede Pangrango ini yang hanya 24.000 hektar, sumber daya manusianya masih kurang. Kita bisa bayangkan bagaimana dengan taman nasional kayak Mentarang yang luasnya 1,3 juta hektar, atau mungkin juga taman nasional Lawrence bahkan 2,5 juta hektar dengan topografi yang luar biasa sulit. Dan tantangan yang lain selain budget dan sumber daya tentu adalah tekanan dari kebutuhan pembangunan, bahwa apalagi di daerah-daerah yang relatif padat penduduk, bahwa kebutuhan lahan untuk pengembangan pembangunan masih sangat tinggi dan kemudian mulai banyak masuk ke kawasan konservasi. Nah, tentu perlu strategi agar bagaimana pembangunan tetap bisa berjalan, tapi kemudian fungsi-fungsi konservasi dari Taman Nasional maupun kawasan konservasi yang lain bisa tetap berjalan dengan baik. Nah, Bapak Ibu yang saya hormati, beberapa tantangan yang lain, kemudian di daerah-daerah yang relatif urban seperti kami, yang wisatanya sudah berkembang dengan baik, dengan pesat, adalah dampak dari kegiatan ekowisata itu sendiri. Jadi kemudian yang muncul adalah pengelolaan terkait sampah, pengelolaan terkait limbah, yang menjadi permasalahan tersendiri ketika kegiatan wisata tidak bisa berjalan dengan baik. Nah, tentu dengan forum yang digagas oleh World Bank ini, kami berharap bahwa berbagai potensi-potensi yang masih tersembunyi yang belum dapat diidentifikasi, kemudian juga bagaimana sebenarnya nilai dari kawasan konservasi itu sendiri secara total economic value dari Taman Nasional, dan kemudian juga berbagai tantangan yang dihadapi dalam pengelolaan, baik dari sisi budget, dari sisi sumber daya manusia, dari sisi impact dan sebagainya, bisa mendapatkan masukan dan juga para pihak yang lain bisa ikut berkontribusi dalam pengelolaan Taman Nasional dan juga kawasan konservasi yang lain di Indonesia. Barangkali itu Bu Naris, Bapak Ibu semuanya yang ingin kami sampaikan. Kami sangat berharap seperti yang disampaikan oleh Pak Wamen dalam courtesy call, yang pengelolaan Taman Nasional di Indonesia bisa semakin baik, dan juga kemudian World Bank bisa memberikan dukungan untuk pengelolaan Taman Nasional yang lebih baik. Barangkali demikian ingin saya sampaikan, kurang lebihnya mohon maaf. Satu top, bila taufiq wal hidayah. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Waalaikumsalam warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Terima kasih banyak Pak Sabto Aji Prabowo. Setelah sesi sambutan, selanjutnya kita akan beranjak ke sesi presentasi. Presentasi pertama akan disampaikan oleh Yuha Sikamaki, Chief Economist IUCN. Kepada Yuha Sikamaki, waktu dan tempat dipersilakan.
Thank you, Nariswati. Can you hear me well?
Yes,
And you
we
can
can.
see the screen.
Yeah.
Perfect. So good afternoon and best greetings from Washington, D.C. I first want to thank the organizers for setting up this event, and thanks very much for our esteemed opening speakers for their excellent remarks. And of course, thank you for inviting me to be part of this webinar. It's a privilege to be here with you today. I will discuss forest ecosystem service valuation in general, but I will focus on the kinds of benefits that are particularly relevant in conservation forests. I'll also focus on valuation approaches that are consistent with the principles of natural capital accounting. As we heard from the opening remarks, conservation of forests is of great deal of importance in Indonesia. And Indonesian forests are exceptional in biodiversity and globally important as such. The topic of forest conservation, of course, is of global importance. One indication of the economic importance of forests comes in the estimates from the World Bank that show that the renewable natural capital, this includes forests, mangroves, agricultural lands, and protected areas, accounts for about 3% of total global economic wealth. So this is complete wealth, everything that can be accounted for. And so the renewable natural capital wealth here is about $32 trillion. Of that renewable natural capital wealth, forests constitute almost 30%. And within that forest wealth, non-wood or non-timber wealth is almost 3/4 of the total forest wealth. So whereas we oftentimes think about timber as perhaps the most important or one of the most important benefits, it's also important to note that roughly 3/4 of the wealth is actually associated with non-timber, non-wood wealth. Now, these are global numbers. At the country level, natural capital wealth is relatively yet more important in many countries, especially in developing countries. In low-income countries, for example, renewable natural assets, such as land and ecosystems, are especially crucial. They comprise around 23% of the total wealth, total economic wealth of low-income countries. So given the importance of renewable natural resources, such as forests, it is clear that robust data are needed to understand economic dependencies, benefits, and risks associated with them. Without robust data, managing nature, managing forests for different societal goals, such as biodiversity, climate, and human well-being, is simply impossible. This has been recognized by the international community and many countries, of course, including Indonesia, as being one of the developers of the statistical framework, accounting framework called System of Environmental Economic Accounting, often referred to as SEEA. Developing this framework to provide consistent data on the linkages between nature, economy, and human well-being. In much of my presentation, I discuss valuation of forests in a way that draws from the development of the SEEA, especially SEEA ecosystem accounting, and findings throughout its construction. Natural capital is an umbrella term that refers to nature as a form of economic asset. Here, nature is viewed as a stock asset, as a form of capital, similar as manufactured capital or financial capital, just being nature. But that capital nevertheless yields dividends. It yields dividends in the form of ecosystem services. And those ecosystem services then bring in benefits to people, society, and also help maintain nature. By definition, ecosystem services are the contributions of ecosystems to economic and other human activity. The System of Environmental Economic Accounting, ecosystem accounting, or SEEA ecosystem accounting, is the adopted international standard for natural capital accounting. SEEA is an integrated biophysical economic measurement framework to measure and report on those stocks and flows of natural capital and their linkages to economy and well-being. The key advantage here is that the framework is consistent with other key international standards and principles for economic accounting, including the system of national accounting. This then enables natural capital accounting to generate metrics that are consistent across scales, including within a country, between countries, and over time. And they are also readily comparable to headline economic indicators such as GDP. The SEEA ecosystem accounting framework involves 5 different but integrated accounts. The first account includes ecosystem account that measures and classifies the extent of different ecosystems in the accounting area. And the accounting area here can be a country or a region within a country, or it can actually be even a specific actor or administrative unit. The framework applies. After measuring ecosystem extent, the condition of those ecosystems are measured to understand their degree of degradation. Following extent and condition assessments, then ecosystem services are measured first in biophysical flows that come from the ecosystems, and then monetary values are addressed on those biophysical flows, so that the money metrics of the value of ecosystem services can be developed and attributed to ecosystems. Then finally, combining all this information helps measure the value of natural capital as an economic asset in the final 5th account. The key aspect here is that the framework is integrated, so that rather than focusing only on, say, biophysical attributes of ecosystems or only on their monetary values, the assessment does both, and it integrates them very much in the same way in which ecosystems, economy, and society are also integrated. The assessment is spatial, and it uses standardized metrics and typologies throughout, aiming to generate high quality and comparable statistics to support economic and policy decisions. Let me now move to discussing the measurement of forest ecosystem services. The first step in the measurement and valuation of forest ecosystem services involves identifying the type of ecosystem service in question. In this table, I've listed examples of forest ecosystem services using the reference list of the ecosystem services that was developed and published in the SIA ecosystem accounting. The list is structured at the highest level into 3 broad categories: provisioning services, regulating and maintenance services, and cultural services, along with non-use services as a subcategory. Of these categories, provisioning services represent benefits that are extracted or harvested from forests. These include services such as biomass, timber, could be also various non-timber products such as nuts, berries, and so forth. Genetic material and water are also part of the provisioning services. Regulating services result from the ability of ecosystems to regulate biological processes and maintain environmental conditions that are beneficial to individuals, economy, and society. Forests, of course, are well known for their contributions to climate regulation, rainfall regulation, soil quality, soil and sediment retention, water purification, and flow regulation, just to name a few examples. Finally, cultural services are the experiential, intangible services that are related to, for example, recreation, education, scientific research services, visual amenity, spiritual, artistic, and even symbolic benefits that arise from and are supported by forests. And non-use values, on the other hand, they relate to especially ecosystem and species appreciation concerns that then may drive people in actually placing economic value on the existence and preservation of forests for current, but also sometimes especially future generations. And these are values that are irrespective of any direct or indirect use. In ecosystem accounting, the primary motivation, yes. In ecosystem accounting, the primary motivation for monetary valuation using a common is monetary valuation using a common monetary unit, so that we're able to make comparisons that are consistent with standard measures of products and assets as recorded in national accounts. And this requires a concept what we call an exchange value. Exchange value is defined in the system of national accounts as the value at which goods, services, labor, or assets are in fact, in reality, exchanged, or they could be exchanged for cash. In this figure, this exchange price is denoted by letter P. What's important to note here is that many valuation studies and many valuation methods focus on understanding and measuring what we call a consumer surplus. This is an area that is denoted in blue in figure here. And so this means that some of the results from the valuation literature are not directly applicable to accounting. However, oftentimes the exchange prices can still be derived from the data and results from studies that estimate consumer surplus. In terms of valuation principles, the general advice from the system of national accounts is that one ought to use directly observable prices whenever possible. But when directly observable prices are not available, they may be estimated from by prices from similar markets, from related markets, or even using cost of production. And this is the framing and order of preference here that SIA ecosystem accounting also recommends for valuation. The most direct method for estimating exchange prices is based on direct observation of exchanges in the markets. For example, timber values may be estimated using stumpage values that landowners receive from timber logging businesses. These are directly observable. When market prices are not directly observable, valuation according to market price from markets that are similar can be used as approximations to market prices. So for example, when non-wood forest products from one forest are marketed, but those from a similar forest are not, the prices observed in the former can be used to value the non-wood forest products in the latter. When neither direct or similar market prices are available, methods where the price for the ecosystem service is embodied in market transaction can support valuation. Here, the concept of residual value and resource rent method is oftentimes used to estimate a value by taking the gross value of the final marketed good and then deducting the cost of all inputs, including labor, produce assets, and intermediate inputs, and then estimating the residual value as the contribution of ecosystem to the total value. And where these methods described in steps 1 to 3 are not available, it's still possible to use data about revealed expenditures, for example, in related goods and services. These are commonly used as referred to as cost-based methods. And let me jump to the next example straight. I will note that there's a great deal of variation in the valuation methods, but as I'll show in a while, for specific services we usually have one or two, only a few methods that are applicable and recommended. I will next discuss some evaluation examples in practice, starting from an example of valuing non-wood forest products using an example directly from Indonesia. So I'm not one of the authors of this study, but I found it very adequate for this audience. Here, the authors, Suwardi and colleagues, they studied benefits from wild edible fruits in Gunung Leuser National Park in the Aceh Tamiang region. Apologies for my poor pronunciation here. Using the classification of ecosystem services that I listed earlier, benefits from wild edible fruits belong to the class of provisioning services. They're non-wood forest products. And their valuation can be addressed using data on market prices, either directly or from similar markets. And in this case, the authors use direct market pricing. And they estimated that households that are studied earned a total annual income from wild edible berries, on average, that was more than 13 million rupiah per household per year. This is a significant amount of income, of course, as you would be able to recognize. For the use of valuation, especially for use of valuation for accounting, however, this study result does not concern the cost of that production. So, in order to move to the value of a forest as a contributor to this value, one needs to deduct the cost of all other inputs, including labor, other inputs from the gross income. This study is not focused on documenting the cost. It was not the focus there. So to use these results for valuation for accounting, one would need to deduct the production expenses from this total number. The ideal way here would involve generating primary data that would be specific to this location, but in the absence of those data, a very crude but somewhat common approach is to use assumed resource rent ratio. Simply thinking, what is the portion of the gross income that is left after covering all the expenses? If we assume that the resource rent would be 30% of gross income, then the forest would still contribute roughly 4 million rupiah per household per year. And so this is a significant amount. Again, it's lower than the total income, but I would note that this is considered here simply for illustration. Again, primary local data on costs would be needed for added accuracy and adequacy for valuation. Next, let me discuss global climate regulation services by forests. This is another highly relevant service in Indonesia and globally. The measurement approach recommended in the SIA-EA is to consider climate regulation services as a single service consisting of two components: carbon retention and carbon sequestration. So this simply reflects the importance of ecosystems, both in terms of removing carbon from the atmosphere, as well as storing, retaining carbon over a longer period of time. Assessing carbon retention component first involves estimating the carbon stock in the ecosystems. Then this stock is multiplied by a suitable carbon price. And then this total value is turned into an annual service flow by creating an annuity. CIEA ecosystem accounting here recommends applying a social cost of carbon to value retention services. There's a number of estimates available for social cost of carbon, but the review by the US government now already from 10 years ago, from 2013, is still one of the most comprehensive ones. And it gives a mean value of roughly $57 per ton of social cost of carbon for the year 2030. After year 2030 and until the year 2030, the value gradually increases. And for carbon sequestration component, the use of market price is recommended whenever that may be available. For climate regulation, let me briefly discuss an example related to mangroves. Again, highly relevant to Indonesia as the leading country of mangrove extent globally, with about 20% of our global mangroves found in Indonesia. In this study, we estimated the supply of emission reductions from mangroves. And to do so, we compiled spatial data on mangroves, including their extent, their biomass above ground and in the soils. And we also measured the mangrove loss rates in different locations, combined with the opportunity cost of conserving mangroves. In a very brief way, I'll just summarize that we found that the biophysical supply and the biophysical characteristics and even the economic characteristics of key variables are spatially highly variable. This involves carbon content, loss rates, almost everything. We also found that most mangroves would be cost effective to protect just based on the value of avoided emissions, especially if we use the social cost of carbon estimates that are available. Benefit valuation of climate regulation here was not within the scope of the study, but results from this study and this study similar to this can be used for benefit valuation by using data on social cost of carbon and even market prices from, say, carbon credit markets where they apply. Let's next discuss water services. Water services include many subcategories: water purification, water flow regulation, and flood control services. And their measurement and valuation varies depending on the service. In the next slides, I will discuss valuation of water purification as one of the examples of water service valuation. These results come from a study that we did in Costa Rica to value water purification services. We use monthly data from across the country on water treatment plants. This included data from their water intakes on water quality coming to the treatment plants. We had data on upstream watersheds, and then we combined this data with plant level treatment costs to improve water quality and provide high quality water for consumption. In brief, we found that the forest cover in upstream watersheds had the beneficial role of reducing water turbidity, so increasing the water quality at the water plant water intake. And this then in turn made water treatment less costly, in some ways easier. It reduced the amount of money that water plants needed to spend on water treatment chemicals. And when we put this into numbers, we found that this service by forests reduced water treatment cost on average by about $9.50 per hectare per year. And this, of course, is not the total value of the forest, but it's an example of a valuation that is related directly to a very distinct economic outcome and an actual expense that would occur if some of those forests are lost. Here, I'll discuss briefly the topic of value transfer. It is common that primary valuation is not feasible or not even necessary when we value ecosystem services. One possible approach is to use a value transfer approach. In value transfer approach, we use valuation results originally developed for another location, and we apply them to conduct benefit valuation at a new site ideally for the same service or a related service. I won't go into any detail on the value transfer method, but I wanted to note that we're currently at IUCN developing and jointly with the World Bank developing a value transfer approach that uses a meta-analysis of forest non-wood ecosystem service valuation literature. The purpose of this assessment is to first compile a global database of original valuation studies that are consistent with the requirements of natural capital accounting. Then, by compiling local data on the economic, social, ecological, and environmental determinants of value of ecosystem services, we use statistical regression and machine learning techniques to develop a predictive model of the value of forest non-wood ecosystem services around all forests, not just those forests that have been subject to original valuation estimates. And we want to do the transfer in a way that takes into account the characteristics of the target forests. And we identified from more than 1,300 studies, then we identified 231 studies and extracted 352 values that are consistent with the principles of natural capital accounting. In the final data set, we also have 9 studies for Indonesia. And this table here reports the valuation methods in the primary studies we identified by ecosystem service assessed. For non-wood forest products, we find that it's common that a market price approach is used for valuation. 47 out of 65 studies use that method. For water services, the use of avoided cost and production cost methods are most common. Their use depends on the specific subservice addressed, but here again we find in this subset that these are the key methods when we look for studies that are consistent with the natural capital accounting principles. For recreation, we find that the so-called travel cost method is the key method there. I'm gonna start concluding here by offering a few additional observations. First, I would note that valuation methods vary quite significantly, but they also have some commonalities in their applications, especially in their current applications. First of all, valuation studies are increasingly taking advantage of spatial data, and this includes satellite and other remote sense data. It's also increasingly common to see integrated ecological economic assessments. And in empirical estimations, it's increasingly common to see panel data approaches that are preferred for accurate estimation. And these panel data approaches literally collect the observations on many points of time on the same endpoint, like the one study that I discussed about water purification valuation in Costa Rica. Second, and following on this note on integrated ecological economic assessments, it is often helpful that a common framework is used for both physical and monetary measurements and values. So this way, the linkages between ecosystems, extent, condition, and ecosystem services both in their physical and monetary metrics can be best understood. And once they are understood, the entire system can be managed for policy design for the goals that we set for the specific system. If we only focus on biophysical or monetary aspects, we're much more limited in our ability to use and have information to improve management and policy. And finally, I would note that economic values often vary greatly by local conditions. It's very unusual that the same service would have a robust value estimated at the same value across many different locations, especially for forests. Benefits from non-wood forest products, water quality, flood control services, and even recreation are often quite local. So we often need local data, or at least data that is reflective of the local conditions to conduct accurate valuation. At the same time, we do have examples where the same value can apply across the globe. And here, of course, climate regulation services are global in benefits, and as such, they ought to be valued using global or sometimes national values if there's a value available for the services from markets. And I will conclude at this. I will thank you for your attention. Terima kasih. Thank you. Over to you, Norisvari.
Terima kasih banyak atas presentasinya Yuha. Presentasi kedua akan disampaikan oleh Rob Smith. Sebelumnya saya ingin mengingatkan bahwa untuk sesi pertanyaan, nanti pertanyaan bisa diberikan melalui kolom chat atau raise hand. Kepada Rob Smith, waktu dan tempat dipersilakan.
Great. Thank you very much, Naris, and thank you also to the World Bank and to my colleagues in Indonesia for the opportunity to speak to you again. It's a pleasure to be back. I'm equally impressed this time around to see the large number of participants in the seminar. So it's really encouraging to see this great level of interest in natural capital accounting in Indonesia. So I'm very much happy to be back and looking forward to tonight's session as well. Excuse me. So I'm just going to try to share my screen here if I can. Give me 1 second. So hopefully you're seeing my presentation. Yeah.
Yeah.
Wonderful. Great. Okay, good. Well, I'd also like to thank and compliment my colleague Juha for an excellent presentation. I almost wonder if I need to give my presentation now because he covered so much of the same ground. But I think it's useful to hear similar ideas and similar thoughts from two different people. I guess in some sense it confirms that at least the two of us think it very much the same way when it comes to this kind of work. But I think I will try to pick up and emphasize some of the points that Juha made so clearly in his presentation. So I'll start with a little bit of an effort to answer the question why we should measure protected areas. Talk a little bit about how to measure them in biophysical terms, and then also a little bit about how to measure them in monetary terms, although I won't go into nearly the detail that Juha did. I'll talk a little bit more about the challenges that I see in measurement, because this is a difficult area of natural capital accounting. Excuse me. And I think it's important to acknowledge the challenges and realize that any government, excuse me, including, I'm going to have some water. Give me 1 second. Sorry. Sorry, apologies for that. Any government, including the government of Indonesia, that wants to undertake work in this area, I think needs to go into the work with a clear understanding of some of the challenges and what they are. So I will speak a little bit about that. I'll give you some more examples of ecosystem valuation in the real world, so to speak, and then hopefully we'll have lots of time for discussion. So why do we want to account for protected areas? Well, I mean, I think, and we've heard a lot about this already, and it came through in Juha's presentation as well, that measuring protected areas is helpful to the people whose job it is to manage protected areas. So if we don't have data, whether they're biophysical data or whether they're monetary data on protected areas, then it's more difficult for the people whose job it is to conserve these areas and manage them to make the case for conservation and management. And it's particularly difficult, I think, to make the case for expanding protected areas if we don't have good data on the value of existing protected areas. Making the case to add new ones is that much more difficult. So I found an interesting study where a very nice valuation effort was made to put a value on the national park system in the United States. And of course, the United States has a very well-known, even world famous national park system with many iconic national parks. And, you know, I think the American population are justifiably very proud of it. So this study, interestingly, found that even though the Americans are very proud of and do fund their national park system quite well, by looking at the values, the monetary values of the national parks in the United States, this study concluded that, in fact, they should spend 10 times more on their national parks than they do right now, which I thought that was quite illuminating. And I think it's a very useful example of how these kinds of data on protected areas can help the managers of protected areas to make the case for improving or increasing the effort that is put into managing the protected areas. So how can we then go about measuring protected areas? I think we can all agree that it's a good idea to measure them. There are many benefits that one could derive from a program to measure protected areas. So how do we do it if we want to do it? Well, I think Juha very nicely in his presentation showed us that measurement of protected areas is really can be broken into two categories. There is measurement that is undertaken in biophysical terms, and there's a lot of richness and sort of complexity that can be brought to the measurement of protected areas in biophysical terms. And then on the other hand, we can also measure them in monetary terms. And there's a whole lot more richness and complexity that can be brought to their measurement in monetary terms. But I think that one of the points that I wanted to emphasize in my words this morning is that no matter what your objective is in terms of measuring protected areas, you always have to start with biophysical quantification. So even if you want ultimately to derive a monetary value for a protected area, you first have to have good, sound data describing that protected area in biophysical terms. So I'm going to suggest to everybody on today's call that should be the starting point for any effort in Indonesia to measure protected areas, is first and foremost to look at the existing biophysical data that you have describing your protected areas and to fill any gaps in those biophysical data before thinking about moving on to monetary valuation. So I really want to emphasize that point. I think it's really an important one. So in terms of measuring things in biophysical terms, Juha mentioned in his talk the international statistical standard that exists and that has been compiled by colleagues around the world and published by the United Nations. And this is called the System of Environmental and Economic Accounting. And that system, that handbook, if you like, on ecosystem accounting, provides a lot of guidance on how to measure protected areas and all types of ecosystems in biophysical terms. And so if you look in that handbook, you will see that there are two basic types of biophysical measurement. The first is very straightforward. The first is simply basic measures of the extent or the size of protected areas. So we need to know how big they are. We need to know where they're located. And importantly, we need to understand how they are how they exist in ecological terms. So we need to measure not just the simple extent of, let's say, a national park. We have to break down the measurement of the extent by the different ecosystem types that are found within the national park. So Juha's colleagues at the IUCN have provided a really excellent and up-to-date classification that can be used to define the land cover or the ecosystem classifications that can be used for the purposes of measuring the extent of protected areas. And I would strongly recommend that land cover classification be the one that is adopted in Indonesia for the purpose of protected area accounting. It's really a first class piece of work, and the IUCN should be really congratulated for having published it. So that's the first thing, is you need to measure the extent of your protected areas, and that extent needs to be broken down by the different ecosystems or land cover types that are found within the protected area. And then the next thing that I think is really important is also to measure protected areas in terms of their protection level. Because of course, not every protected area is protected in the same way. Some protected areas have very high levels of protection applied to them, where practically no form of human activity is permitted. And then there are protected areas where all sorts of human activity is permitted. And again, the IUCN has a really excellent classification of protection level that can be applied to the measurement of ecosystems. So that would be my advice, is that in Indonesia, you should start to compile high quality extent accounts for your protected areas that break down protected areas both in terms of the land cover or the ecosystems and in terms of the level of protection that is provided or that is accorded to the park. The good news is that doing this kind of work today versus doing it, say, 2 or 3 decades ago is really a lot easier. And that's because of the advent of 2 things. One, spatial data collected by satellites, which are very widely available today. And then secondly, the increasing sophistication and power of geographic information system software that can be used to treat those spatial data. So it is increasingly possible to compile the kind of extent accounts that I'm talking about here without really having to use anything other than satellite data. I'm not saying you can do it exclusively with satellite data, but you can certainly do a very good job using only satellite data. So that's a really helpful feature of the progress that's been made in this area of statistics. So once we've measured the extent of ecosystems or protected areas, the next step is to look at the condition of the ecosystems within the protected area. And here things unfortunately get quite a lot more complicated. It's one thing to measure the area of a particular type of tropical forest, for example. It's another thing to then collect the data and the indicators that are necessary to express the condition of that tropical forest. But again, the United Nations System of Environmental and Economic Accounting provides lots of guidance on how ecosystem condition should be measured. It is quite a lot more data intensive, and it can't be done using satellite data in the same way that measuring extent can be done. But nonetheless, it needs to be done because it's an essential part of understanding the evolution of ecosystem quality. So we need to have an understanding of condition at various points in time so that we can determine whether effectively determine whether the quality of ecosystems is changing as time goes by. So even though it's difficult, we can't avoid the need to measure the condition of ecosystems. Okay, so that's biophysical measurement in very, very simple terms. And again, Juha's presentation gave you lots of other things to think about in that regard. Now, if we want to move on to monetary measurement, here things can get really quite a lot more complicated. And I think you probably got the idea from Juha's presentation that the literature on the valuation of ecosystems is large, and it is very large, and it's getting bigger all the time. So it is challenging to stay on top of the trends in the valuation methods, the concepts, and the data sources that are used. And so this is an area where you want to make sure that you've done your homework before entering into any kind of serious valuation work. And one thing that I would point out, and this is unfortunate, but I think true, is that not all valuation studies are well done. There's an awful lot of poor valuation studies and an awful lot of poor, unfortunately, economics that gets applied to the valuation of ecosystems. So I would suggest that you should be cautious as you move in this into this area, and you should be skeptical of valuation studies that appear to be too simplistic, because they are often based on thinking that is itself too simplistic. So I would caution a certain amount of approach here. There are a number of valuation methods that are generally accepted, and Juha's presentation listed a lot of those, and he went into that in considerable detail. So, and there's obviously lots more to learn about how to apply those. But things like hedonic pricing, measurement of valuation using the cost of traveling to recreational sites, replacement cost methods, avoided damages methods, contingent valuation. These are all economic approaches that are quite well worked out in the literature and that can be applied effectively to the valuation of ecosystems. But as I say, they aren't always applied appropriately or effectively. So you do want to be careful about what studies you look to for guidance in this area. So this is a useful graphic that outlines the kinds of values that one would want to consider when measuring ecosystems. And one of the points that I think is worth emphasizing here is that when you're looking at the valuation of ecosystems, it's important to consider both the cost and the benefit side. So in Juha's presentation, he talked about a study that looked at the benefit of non-timber wood products in a particular region of Aceh province in Indonesia. But he mentioned that the study didn't look at the costs of extracting those edible wild fruits. And it's important that we look at both sides of the equation, because of course, if you're interested in the net benefit of an ecosystem to a population, then it is really the benefits minus the costs that reflect that net benefit. So that's a mistake I think that gets made, unfortunately, too frequently in the valuation work that I see. Economists will measure the benefits forgetting that there are associated costs. And they will sometimes incorrectly use the gross benefits to put an asset value on an ecosystem, and that's really a mistake. And you want to avoid making that kind of mistake in any kind of valuation exercise that you might undertake. So here on this side of the screen, the right side of the graphic, we see the categories of value that can be addressed in a valuation study. And again, these are similar to the ones that Juha presented in one of his slides. One of the points that I want to make about the value of ecosystems that is surprising to a lot of managers when they see the results of valuation studies is that it is often the non-use values of ecosystems that end up with the largest figures associated with them, the largest monetary value associated with them. So the work, for example, that I have done in Canada on the valuation of ecosystem services from the Great Lakes that are found in southern Canada. In those studies, it's really been the non-use values that have been the most significant source of value. For example, the provisioning services of the Great Lakes in terms of the supply of fish or other products that might be extracted from the lakes, those provisioning services are almost negligible, actually, in comparison with the non-use values. The recreation values can be quite significant, but usually not as significant as the non-use values. So I think there is sometimes the expectation when undertaking a valuation study that there's going to be a lot of value associated with the direct use of ecosystems. And sometimes that's simply not the case. So I think an open mind on that is important when you're undertaking valuation. So another point that Juha raised in his talk was the distinction between what is called in the literature primary valuation studies and what's called benefits transfer valuation studies, or value transfer was, I think, the term that Juha had used. Both are important. And in fact, primary valuation studies are really much more important than benefit transfer approaches. But the problem is that primary valuation studies are, generally speaking, relatively time-consuming and expensive to undertake. And that's why I think far too often in the literature on ecosystem valuation, we see economists using benefits transfer approaches instead of primary valuation studies. And I've actually seen studies where I can't find any primary valuation study that has gone into the valuation of an ecosystem. The entire valuation exercise is done using benefits transfer approaches. And even worse, they are done using benefits transfer studies that refer to one another. So you have this kind of circular analysis that ends up being done in some of these studies, which leads me to question the validity of the results of those studies quite significantly. So again, I'm cautioning you to avoid what I call the benefits transfer trap, the trap of relying too much on benefits transfer. I would be very happy to see the government of Indonesia investing in primary valuation studies to the greatest extent possible in any valuation exercise that it might undertake. Another point that I wanted to emphasize about valuation of ecosystems is that it's important to realize that sometimes the value of an ecosystem is actually already captured in the value of some other asset that might be measured by a government. And I can give you, I think, a good illustration of this. So earlier in my talk, I referred to this study that had been done in the United States on the value of the national park system in the US. Now, it turns out in that study that the most valuable park in the United States, by a very, very large margin, is in fact Central Park in New York City. So Central Park, as some of you may know, is a very famous, very large urban park that is found in the middle of the island of Manhattan, which is pretty much the center of New York City. And this park, Central Park, was found by the authors of this study to have a value per hectare that was, I think, something like 10 times greater than any other park in the United States. And of course, the reason for that excessive value of Central Park is that a lot of that value is reflected in the very expensive real estate, the very expensive apartments and condominiums and other kinds of buildings that are found around Central Park in New York. So it's true that those buildings derive some of their value from their proximity to Central Park, but we have to be careful not to add the value of Central Park that is due to the value of those apartments and condominiums to the value of the apartments and condominiums themselves. And I have seen instances where that kind of double counting takes place, and I really think that it's something that we have to be careful to avoid in valuation studies. So just a couple of more words on valuation. There are some really excellent online tools that have been developed to help practitioners working on ecosystem valuation. There are two that are quite well known. One is the so-called InVEST tool that has been put together by researchers at the University of Stanford. And then there's a newer one that is called Ares for SIA, which is a tool that has been developed by the United Nations with researchers from Spain. And that Ares for SIA tool is designed specifically to produce ecosystem valuations that are consistent with the concepts and methods of the system of environmental and economic accounts. So that can be quite useful. So just a few more words before I move on to some practical examples of valuation. Juha has pretty much said all of this already, but I'll repeat it because it's important to hear. So the fact is that quantifying protected areas or any ecosystem is complicated. Protected areas vary greatly in terms of their ecology and their size. They provide, each one provides unique ecosystem services that benefit different groups. And this point is particularly important. The groups that benefit from ecosystem or from protected areas, I should say, determine to a great extent the value of those protected areas. So the relationship between human populations and protected areas is very important in valuation exercises. Ecosystem services flow from protected areas over different geographic areas, and they flow at different temporal rates. Yeah, and the final point is simply that the relationship with human populations varies a lot and impacts the nature and value of the service flows. So all this to say that the valuation is complicated. It needs to be undertaken carefully. It needs to be undertaken with a really good understanding of the concepts and the methods that are available. And it needs to be undertaken, I think, with a good understanding of the kinds of errors that can be made so that errors ultimately are avoided. So I wanted just to give you some examples of some actual quantification efforts at quantification of ecosystems. Some of what I will show you are efforts that are biophysical in nature, and then there are others that are focus on monetary quantification. So what we have here is some work that was done by the Statistical Office in Canada to look at the water purification potential of the part of Canada that is covered by what is known as the boreal forest. So the boreal forest is a very large and important forest in Canada and Finland, for that matter, and all northern countries. It's sort of like the tropical forest of the northern countries. Very, very important ecosystem. And what we're looking at here is the change in water purification potential between 2000 and 2010. So what the researchers found was that there were certain hotspots in the country where there were quite substantial decreases in that water purification potential. And an awful lot of the decreases in potential are found in this sort of northwestern part of Canada, which is where all of the oil and gas extraction activity takes place. So really, I think what is being shown here is the impact of deforestation, fragmentation of the forest, and so on, as a result of fossil fuel extraction activity. Now, this particular study did not focus on the protected areas within the boreal forest. There are lots of protected areas within the boreal forest, but that wasn't a focus of this study. But it would have been interesting if they had looked at the protected areas to see whether or not protected areas did better than other ecosystems in terms of maintaining their potential for water purification. So next, I wanted to show you a study that does, in fact, demonstrate that protected areas do help in terms of conserving ecosystem function. So what we have here is the result from some work that was done on a protected area within the country of Portugal. And they looked at the value. In this case, this was a valuation study. So they looked at the value of different ecosystem services from this particular park area over different levels of protection. So it's interesting to see that for pretty much all of the ecosystem services provided, the value of those services increased with increasing protection. But it didn't increase continually. So once the protected area got to what the researchers called partial protection, the value of the ecosystem service tended to level off. So there didn't seem to be a big difference between the value of ecosystem services from totally protected parts of the park to only partially protected parts of the park. So I thought that was an interesting conclusion. Here we have some more data, in this case, socioeconomic data. So I wanted to include this slide to show you that there are lots of different kinds of data that can be used to quantify the value of protected areas. You don't have to use just traditional environmental variables or economic variables. You can use household socioeconomic variables as well, which is what's been shown here. So what we're looking at in this slide is the access to and the use of urban parks that are close to where people live in Canada. And so the interesting thing I think to observe here is that the wealthier you are in Canada, the better access you have to urban green space. So the people earning less than $20,000 a year, only 75% of those households had ready access to a park, whereas for households earning $150,000 a year or more, they had 95% of those households had ready access. And it's also interesting to observe that the rate at which urban areas are used by households also increases with income. So I think this is an example of what can be called, or what has been called, environmental discrimination or environmental poverty, where households that are poor have less access to ecosystem goods and services than households who are more well off. The bottom part of the chart here shows something that anybody who has children will readily understand, I think, and that is that when you've got kids in the house, having a house or having a park close by is a good thing. So you can see that children or households with children in them make very high use of urban green space, which is to be expected. All right, so here we have a study that was done on the value of carbon sequestration. So this is the value of a climate regulation service of a very famous protected area in Canada called Algonquin Provincial Park, a lovely part of Canada. I'm very fortunate to live not too far from this part of the country, and it is really a truly beautiful and still very wild and natural area. So here the researchers valued the carbon sequestration of Algonquin Park using a social cost of carbon estimate, which is commonly done in the literature. That's something that you see quite frequently. My view is that use of the social cost of carbon for the valuation of carbon sequestration is questionable because of the way that the social cost of carbon itself is constructed. I don't want to get too much into the details, but essentially my concern is that the social cost of carbon is a value that is relevant to understanding small changes in greenhouse gas or carbon emissions, but not necessarily relevant to putting a value on every ton of carbon that is emitted or sequestered. So I do have some concerns about the use of social cost of carbon as the valuation of climate regulation services. But as I say, it is very commonly done in the literature. Here, this is another effort at valuing the ecosystem goods and services of this same park, Algonquin Park. But here, what we're looking at is the aesthetic value of the park. So the value of the park purely because it provides beautiful scenery. And the way that the researchers valued that was using a travel cost approach. So they basically made a relationship between the amount that people paid to travel to the park to take advantage of the park's recreational opportunities, and the quality of the visual amenity that those people enjoyed. I think it probably greatly underestimates the actual value of the visual amenity. And I would have been much happier with this study if they had been able to use primary willingness to pay data. If they had actually asked the users of the park how much would they be willing to pay to have some kind of an improvement in the visual amenity service. That would have been much more satisfactory. But nonetheless, it's an interesting study, and I thought it was worth showing to you. All right, here, this is a study that was done again in Canada, not specifically for protected areas. This is simply looking at all ecosystem values in the southern part of Canada. And the point that I want to make here is that, so it's important to look at the legend here on the graphics. So the blue colored areas are the areas where the value of the ecosystem services is highest. And so what's important to recognize about this map is that the blue areas represent all of the really highly populated parts of southern Canada. So here we have the city of Toronto, which has about 5 million inhabitants, the biggest city in Canada. Here we have the capital city of Canada, which is Ottawa, where I live. Has about 1.5 million inhabitants, and so on. So all of these blue areas are areas where people live. And the reason why the ecosystem, the value of the ecosystem services in those areas is so high is because much of the value that we place on ecosystems is associated with human use of the ecosystem in one way or another. And this can lead, I think, to the conclusion that ecosystems that are located far away from people aren't worth very much. And I think that's not the case. And I think we want to avoid sending the message that that is the case, because there are all sorts of ecosystem services that are provided by ecosystems that have nothing to do at all with the presence of humans, and in fact, in many instances are disrupted by the presence of humans. So carbon sequestration is a good example of that. So the value of carbon sequestration doesn't matter, has nothing to do with how close a protected area or an ecosystem is to a human population. So I think it's important to be careful to avoid sending incorrect policy signals with ecosystem valuation results when they show this strong relationship between values and human inhabitation. So this is another study that I found that I thought was interesting. This was one of the relatively rare examples of a primary valuation study. This was done by some colleagues from the University of Alberta, a couple of whom are very well known environmental economists, Peter Boxall and Vic Adamovich. So this study was looking at what would be the net benefit of increasing protected areas in a certain part of Canada. And so the researchers conducted their own primary valuation study, a contingent valuation study. They interviewed 1,629 Canadians to assess their willingness to pay for the expansion of protected areas. And then they looked at the costs of expanding protected areas, because it's not free. There are costs associated with expanding them. And then they did what I talked about earlier, which is they measured the net benefits of expanding protected areas. So they found that the net benefits were in the tens of millions of dollars for going from the existing level of protection, which was about 0.6% of the area, to something around 2 to 5% of the area. So quite substantial net benefits for not very significant increase in protected areas. This was another study that was a primary evaluation study. This one in Nepal, a slightly smaller survey this time, about 300 people in total, some of whom were tourists and some of whom were local users of the park. I think the interesting result here is that the results of the study, which I would think were very robust because they were based on a primary evaluation study, showed that the visitors to the park had a much higher willingness to pay to use the park than they were forced to pay. In other words, the park entry fees were much lower than the willingness of people to pay. So this means that and this is often the case, that park managers don't charge enough for people to use the park. So it's often the case that that people benefit from parks at a rate that is much higher than the cost to them. So I'll leave it at that. I hope we have lots of time still for discussion and questions. There seems to be lots in the chat. Neris, back to you.
Thank you, Rob. Terima kasih banyak, Pak Rob. Presentasi dari Rob menandai selesainya sesi presentasi, dan setelah ini kita akan ada sesi tanggapan dan diskusi yang dimoderasi oleh Ibu Alin Halimatusadiah. Izinkan saya untuk memanggil Ibu Alin dengan sebuah pantun. Kerjasama perlu dijalin, agar kita jadi teladan. Kepada yang terhormat Ibu Alin, waktu dan tempat kami persilakan.
Ya, oke. Terima kasih Mbak Naris atas pantunnya dan perkenalannya. Pemirsa sekalian, kita sekarang masuk pada sisi tanya jawab ya. Anda dapat mengangkat tangan secara virtual menggunakan icon raise hand atau menuliskan pertanyaan di chat box. Kita sudah mendapatkan banyak sekali pertanyaan di chat box, nanti yang akan dijawab oleh Pak Rob dan Pak Yuha. Tapi sebelum kita masuk pada sisi tanya jawab, izinkan saya memberikan sedikit beberapa poin yang saya anggap penting ya dari presentasi yang sudah disampaikan oleh Pak Yuha, Pak Rob, dan juga jadi tadi dari sesi opening. Seperti judul dari webinar ini, Identifying and Realizing the Value of Conservation Forest, kita telah diberi pencerahan oleh kedua pembicara akan pentingnya nilai dari kawasan lindung, khususnya hutan, serta bagaimana mengidentifikasi, mengkuantifikasi, dan memonetisasinya. Pak Yuha memberikan gambaran tentang nilai hutan dan kaitannya dengan kekayaan ekonomi suatu bangsa. Modal alam berkontribusi sekitar 3% dari total kekayaan dunia pada tahun 2018, dan hutan mencakup hampir 30% dari nilai kekayaan modal alam dunia. Secara khusus, nilai dari jasa ekosistem hutan bukan kayu mencakup lebih dari 70% dari kekayaan modal alam hutan global. Mengungkapkan nilai ini penting ya, karena kita bisa mempunyai perspektif baru tentang pentingnya konservasi dan bukan hanya melihat hutan dari nilai kayunya. Nah, bagi negara mega biodiversity seperti Indonesia, tentunya penting untuk mempunyai perspektif bahwa kawasan konservasi adalah merupakan kekayaan kita. Dengan area konservasi, kawasan hutan lebih dari 25 juta hektar, dan target Indonesia untuk memperluas area konservasi kelautan sebesar 30 juta hektar pada tahun 2030, tentunya mengestimasi nilai ekosistem baik dalam perhitungan stok maupun flow dan memasukkannya dalam sistem akuntansi SEA atau System of Environmental Economic Accounting menjadi penting. Dengan mengetahui nilai ini, investasi untuk pengelolaan dan pengembangan wilayah konservasi diharapkan akan lebih meningkat. Seperti kita ketahui bersama, tadi juga disampaikan, saat ini pendanaan untuk kawasan konservasi sangat minim, dengan sumber daya manusia yang juga terbatas. Beberapa hasil penelitian yang tadi disampaikan menunjukkan bahwa memperluas area kawasan konservasi meningkatkan nilai manfaat bersih. Untuk bisa menilai kekayaan modal alam, khususnya dari hutan, kita perlu mengidentifikasi berbagai jenis jasa yang diberikan oleh satu ekosistem hutan, mengkuantifikasi data biofisik, dan kemudian memonetisasinya atau mengestimasi nilainya dalam satuan uang. Secara khusus tadi Pak Rob menekankan pentingnya ukuran biofisik sebelum melakukan monetisasi. Pak Yuha dan Pak Rob juga dengan sangat jelas menjabarkan tahapannya dan berbagai metode yang mungkin dilakukan untuk valuasi ini. Pak Rob juga menekankan supaya kita berhati-hati dalam melakukan valuasi, seperti misalnya jangan sampai terjebak pada benefit transfer trap, penggunaan social cost of carbon, dan lain-lain. Dari Pak Rob kita mempelajari bagaimana nilai estimasi dilakukan di berbagai negara, terutama Kanada. Kita melihat bagaimana masyarakat menempatkan nilai pada kawasan konservasi dan manfaatnya bagi anak-anak untuk mendorong aktivitas yang sehat dan bermanfaat. Tentunya banyak tantangan yang dihadapi untuk melakukan hal ini, apalagi di Indonesia, di mana data terkait valuasi ekosistem lebih terbatas dibandingkan negara maju. Saya berharap nanti dalam diskusi banyak dieksplorasi bagaimana kita bisa meningkatkan kapasitas SDM dan memahami lebih jauh berbagai metode valuasi dan menyusun rasa lingkungan SEA dan juga infrastruktur, misalnya sistem informasi yang terintegrasi dan data yang valid untuk estimasi nilai kawasan konservasi. Tantangan untuk mengelola kawasan konservasi di Indonesia adalah bagaimana berbagai upaya konservasi dapat seiring sejalan dengan keadilan sosial dan inklusif untuk komunitas lokal dan masyarakat adat, utamanya meningkatkan kesejahteraan masyarakat. Kita juga masih mempunyai tantangan terkait SDM, baik sisi kuantitas maupun kualitas untuk mengelola kawasan konservasi secara profesional dan berkelanjutan. Tentunya dengan menyadari nilai ekosistem kawasan konservasi, berbagai pendanaan bisa diarahkan untuk mengatasi semua tantangan ini. Tentunya semua usaha ini membutuhkan kolaborasi dengan banyak pihak. Sekian beberapa poin kesimpulan dan tanggapan saya terhadap pandangan pembicara sebelumnya, terutama Pak Yuha dan Pak Rob. Nah, sekarang kita masuk pada sisi tanya jawab. Jadi Pak Yuha dan Pak Rob, kita mempunyai 13 ya yang sudah saya identifikasi pertanyaan dan komentar, kebanyakan pertanyaan. Nah, saya akan membacakan, nanti juga akan ditranslate oleh interpreter. Dan saya berusaha mengidentifikasi ini pertanyaan sebaiknya untuk siapa, walaupun nanti setiap panelis bisa dengan bebas menjawab pertanyaan yang mungkin bukan saya tujukan untuk siapa. Ya, pertama ini Pak Sunario. Pak Sunario ini punya banyak sekali pertanyaan di sini. Untuk pertanyaan pertama dari Pak Sunario, mungkin saya ditujukan kepada Yuha. Untuk melakukan konservasi hutan dan satwa liar membutuhkan ongkos, tapi manfaatnya dinikmati oleh seluruh manusia di muka bumi ini, tanpa perlu memberikan kontribusi terhadap ongkos pengelolaannya secara berkelanjutan. Istilahnya mungkin seperti free rider gitu ya. Apakah UCN atau World Bank sudah memiliki sistem yang mengatur tentang kontribusi untuk mengcover ongkos pengelolaan hutan ini? Siapa saja yang harus memberi kontribusi dan berapa besarnya, ya? Itu dari Pak Sunario. Kemudian yang kedua dari Pak Satrio Adi Wicaksono, mungkin ini juga bisa untuk Pak Yuha, tapi silakan ya nanti kalau Rob juga mau memberikan tanggapan. One of the logical follow-ups after valuation of non-timber and non-carbon ecosystem service is to ensure that the monetary valuation can be linked with biodiversity financing, such as market-based biodiversity credits, including in protected area. How advanced is the thinking and implementation of biodiversity credits globally and Indonesia? Yang ketiga dari Pak Sudarto, mungkin ini bisa dijawab oleh Rob. Guna melakukan penilaian diperlukan adanya standar. Dalam hal ini di Indonesia ada SPI namanya, Standar Penilaian Indonesia atau regulasi terkait. Bagaimana jika standar tersebut belum ada? Jangankan untuk melakukan penilaian natural resources, untuk melakukan penilaian cagar budaya saja belum diatur. Misalnya Borobudur Temple. Bagaimana dengan hal tersebut? Pertanyaan berikutnya dari Pak Sunario, mungkin untuk Rob. Setelah diketahui nilai dari satu hutan, siapa yang akan membayarnya dan siapa yang akan menerima pembayaran tersebut. Bila tidak ada yang mau membayar ongkos konservasi, bolehkah masyarakat setempat atau pemerintah setempat mengkonversi lahan hutan tersebut untuk dijadikan kebun sawit yang manfaatnya langsung dapat dirasakan oleh masyarakat setempat. Kemudian yang berikutnya ada pertanyaan dari Pak Setiawan, mungkin ini bisa dijawab oleh Rob. Apakah bila nilai sumber daya alam sudah tercatat dalam neraca sumber daya alam suatu negara, ada ketentuan untuk melakukan revaluasi sumber daya alam? Karena kita tahu bahwa kondisi biofisik sumber daya alam seringkali dinamis. Yang berikutnya dari Pak Bayuni, mungkin bisa dijawab oleh Pak Yuha. Aligned to Pak Satrio and Pak Sunario above, how can we advocate the result of valuation of resources to policymakers? What are the best strategies? Berikutnya ada Pak Setiawan yang Pak Setiawan ini memberikan komentar. Waktu lalu saya memperhatikan berita penilaian sumber daya alam di Indonesia digunakan untuk mengestimasi kerusakan hutan yang diakibatkan oleh kebakaran hutan. Ya, ini hanya informasi saja. Yang berikutnya dari Pak Sunario, mungkin ini bisa dijawab oleh Rob. Apakah sudah ada negara yang menerapkan secara penuh dari konsep natural capital ini? Mungkin Costa Rica atau USA atau Swiss. Yang berikutnya dari Pak Wibawa Pramsi Hombing, mungkin ini bisa dijawab oleh Rob. Mohon komentar dari narasumber. Saya melihat mekanisme pengukurannya agak subjektif karena satu, nilainya tergantung dari orang melihat kegunaan dari sumber daya alam tersebut. Dua, selain itu, perbedaan metodologi penilaian yang dipilih juga berdampak pada perbedaan nilai akhir yang didapatkan. Tiga, terlalu banyak faktor yang dinilai, yang akhirnya nilai yang didapatkan juga tidak akurat dan subjektif. Yang berikutnya untuk Pak Yuha mungkin dari Pak Sunario, Taman Nasional Gunung Gede Pangrango merupakan habitat untuk beberapa jenis burung endemik. Penerima manfaat konservasi burung endemik ini siapa? Apakah penerima manfaat tersebut sudah memberikan kontribusi untuk pengelolaan Taman Nasional tersebut? Kalau belum, disarankan IUCN dan World Bank membangun sistem dan menerapkannya sehingga kelestarian dari satwa tersebut dapat lebih terjamin. Yang berikutnya mungkin untuk Yuha juga dari Pak Taufik Rahman, IUCN untuk konteks Indonesia dengan sistem pemerintahan yang juga menganut desentralisasi, bagaimana posisi dan peran pemerintah daerah level provinsi maupun kabupaten kota dalam identifikasi dan kuantifikasi nilai konservasi hutan lindung atau lestari ini. Atau jika pendekatannya kolaborasi dan cross-cutting dengan otoritas nasional atau pusat, bagaimana sebaiknya pola koordinasi dan pembagian perannya. Bagaimana dengan partisipasi publik atau masyarakat dalam wacana ini. Yang berikutnya, ini ada ada dua lagi. Dari Pak Teguh Sonario, mungkin ini bisa untuk Yuha. I think local government not understanding about this topic and we need indicators to value intangible asset. So, need cultural and anthropology approach. Terakhir dari Pak Hairi, ini mungkin bisa Pak Yuha, tidak mudah untuk mengambil kebijakan antara mempertahankan kelestarian hutan dan atau suatu ekosistem. Adanya pendekatan natural capital valuation ini mungkin akan sangat membantu untuk mengambil kebijakan antara mempertahankan atau mengalih fungsi. Faktanya sebagian besar pengambil kebijakan tetap mengambil langkah untuk mengalih fungsi hutan untuk keuntungan atau manfaat yang lebih nyata. Seberapa efektif natural capital valuation sudah melis 8 pertanyaan, tapi sebaiknya di kesempatan untuk Pak Yuha dulu, ya.
Yes, thank you. Can you hear me now?
Yes, Pak Yuha. We can hear you.
Perfect, thank you. So I recognize we have an active audience, so thank you very much for your questions. We have a limited amount of time, so I'll be very brief. I apologize if I'm going to miss some of the important questions. On the question about biodiversity credits, so this of course is a topic of increasing interest and discussion. There, the key issue in some ways is the biophysical valuation. What does a biodiversity conservation at one site generating certain biological benefit, for instance, in the form of preserved biodiversity? How does it compare to biodiversity changes at another site? So there's a biophysical trade-off question. To me, this is the in the heart of the matter. The economic valuation there, I think, will then follow. But it's an area of great deal of current work. Do we need standards? Do we have standards? Yes, we need standards for valuation. I think this is a general answer to several questions. The very purpose of the development ecosystem accounting is to provide a standard for ecosystem service assessment and valuation, so that then these subjective decisions have less of an impact on values. So I'll just note, and maybe also in response a little bit to Rob's presentation, that there's a great deal of variation, heterogeneity in the valuation literature. In the valuation study that I mentioned, where we review studies, we identified over 1,300 studies that were potentially relevant. When we reviewed them for methodology, concepts, and applicability, less than 20% of those studies then became admissible for our purposes. So most of the literature was in fact not helpful for the purposes of accounting, valuation for accounting. So we need standards. On the issue of who benefits from forests, I think we all recognize that forests provide benefits that are of global importance. As such, we should all contribute to their conservation. And this, of course, is not the case yet. We have few international financial flows that would literally involve a cost sharing of those costs. There are some official development aid, for instance, addresses biodiversity. There's some bilateral efforts. There's even some private funding that is aiming at this, but the scale is nowhere what is needed. And this is a key issue in the development of the Kunming-Montreal biodiversity, global biodiversity framework, especially its resource mobilization component. One important step here involves the establishment of a global biodiversity fund, established at the global environmental facility, GEF, and it's currently under development, but hopefully will play a key role in providing this international funding that is so much needed for funding conservation. On the dynamic nature of natural resources that then somebody referred to, that would require that values can change. So this is a good point. Values can change and will change, and for that reason we need repeat assessments. We need continuous updating. It's the same way we measure economy, quarterly, annually. We need to do the same for measuring ecosystem values. They may change less dramatically and quickly, but we do need to do this more than once on a regular basis. On the issue of local governments are key stakeholders here, oftentimes key beneficiaries, and it's critically important that local governments, local populations are involved in the assessment of values, assessment of ecosystems. I think I had more questions, but I'm looking at the clock, and I want to give Rob some time to respond to. But I'll close it by saying that yeah, ecosystem service valuation is not simple. It's very complicated. But I also don't want to leave you with the impression that it's so complicated that it cannot be done. It can be done, but it's a serious undertaking. And I would very much recommend that the Indonesian government in assessing protected areas would undertake economic valuation along with the biophysical assessment, and would do that economic valuation by also developing primary estimates, primary valuation, but would do that primary valuation in a way that doesn't necessarily involve valuing every single protected area, but rather might involve a portfolio of protected areas that as a total set of information would then help develop data for other protected areas today and in the future. So thank you very much, everybody, and over to you. Thanks.
Ya, terima
Salim.
kasih Pak Iwa. Ya, Pak Rob silakan. Dan mungkin bisa menjawab dengan cukup santai. Kita akan mengulur waktu sampai nanti pertanyaan terjawab. Kita akan punya waktu mungkin sampai 30 menit ke depan. Terima kasih. Silakan Pak Rob.
Okay, good. Thank you, Bu Edin. And I in my calendar, the event shows as being 3 hours long, not 2. So I had the understanding that we had lots of time. So forgive me if I went through my slides more slowly than I should have. I thought that we had plenty of time. So I apologize if I've taken up more time than I should have. In any case, I'm happy to stay and answer the questions. So and look, I just also want to echo the very, I think, eloquent and wise comments from Juha about any work in Indonesia. It needs to be taken seriously, and I think the quality of the questions that have been posed in the chat box shows that there's lots of serious thinking that is going on the topic in Indonesia. So that's very encouraging. But this is serious stuff. There's a lot at stake, and I think numbers that are not credible and not sound can do more harm than good sometimes. So I think that it's important to keep that in mind. And just thinking, for example, about this question of conservation and who pays for conservation. Well, that's a very important question. And as Juha says, there are mechanisms being put in place at the moment to permit international monetary flows associated with conservation, so that countries that are biodiversity rich can effectively be paid by countries that are biodiversity poor to preserve this essential global biodiversity. But countries that are going to be making the payments for biodiversity, if there will be such things, are going to expect that the arguments put forward by the countries that have the biodiversity are sound. And so if a government says, look, our biodiversity is worth X million rupiah, the people paying to preserve that biodiversity are going to want to look at those numbers very carefully and be convinced that they are correct and properly done. So this is serious business, and it's getting to be more and more serious, I would say, as time goes by. So I just wanted to make that additional comment. Yeah, in terms of standards, I think we are fortunate to have the SEA system of environmental economic accounts as a standard. It's not perfect, but it's a very good starting point, and it's getting better all the time. And there are lots of really smart people, including Juha and his colleagues at the IUCN and lots of researchers and universities working to improve these standards all the time. So I think things are moving definitely in the right direction. So the question about if there's a value of a natural resource and it changes, can it be revalued on the balance sheet? Yes, absolutely. That's exactly what should happen. So ecosystem accounting, like all forms of accounting, is something that must be done on a regular basis. So it's not really accounting if you simply put a value on a protected area in a study and then never go back and look at that value again. That's what I call environmental statistics, which is different from environmental accounting. If you're doing environmental accounting, then you're going to go back each year and reassess the value of that protected area to see if it has changed. And if it has changed, why has it changed? That's the nature of accounting. It is a time series exercise, and it has to be done in a time series fashion. The question about, is there a country that fully implements the concept of natural capital? No, I wouldn't say that there is any country that has a complete set of ecosystem accounts plus accounts for more traditional natural resources like oil and gas, and that also uses both the ecosystem accounts and the natural resource asset accounts to inform decision making. I don't know of any country that comes that is yet at that level. Canada is getting there, I would say. We have some pretty good natural resource accounts, and recently our work on measuring ecosystems has really picked up. But I don't think that the policy side of the government of Canada uses those statistics as much as it should. So remember, it's not sufficient simply for a statistical office to compile these data, these accounts. The policy side of government has to then use the statistics to drive different kinds of decision making. So yeah, I can't think of a country where we have the combination of a really strong statistical effort plus a really strong policy effort that covers both natural resources and ecosystems. We're not quite there yet, I wouldn't say. There was an interesting question about the subjectivity and the sort of difficulty in valuation because of differences in methodology and so on. And I think we've answered that to some extent by saying, look, you should follow the system of environmental accounts standards. But it's also true. It's a very fair point. This is an area of economics that is rapidly evolving, where there is a certain degree of subjectivity, where things are not always done, correctly, I would say. So it is a challenging area. And this is one of the reasons why I think both Juha and I have said that, you need to take it seriously and invest the time and effort in the compilation of the data that are necessary to do it well, but also to invest the time and effort in building the professional staff who will be able to work with those data, compile those data, and then turn them into statistics. And then you need also to invest in the policy side so that you have a group of policymakers and decision makers who are also capable of using the data. So it is challenging. There's a lot to this, but the sooner we get at it, the better. There was a question about, should we cut down forests for palm oil plantations if no one will pay for the conservation of the biodiversity? I mean, look, that's what happens in many instances, right? There's a reason why countries cut down forests and put in beef cattle farms and palm oil plantations and so on, and that is because the products that are that flow out of a cattle farm or a palm oil plantation are relatively easily measured and are very visible in national income. So I think those of us who want to promote the conservation of forests and to avoid the conversion into cattle farms and palm oil plantations need to come up with valuations of the ecosystem goods and services that demonstrate why we shouldn't be allowing that conversion to happen, to take place, at least why we shouldn't be allowing it to happen at the extent that it happens right now. So that's why this work is serious, and that's why it needs to be done well. Another question about the role of local and regional governments in this. And I have to say that I can't answer that question very thoughtfully for Indonesia because I don't understand enough about the governance structures in Indonesia. But let me say a word about the way that natural resources are managed in Canada, and you can tell me if it applies in Indonesia or not. But in Canada, the natural resources and ecosystems are not really the responsibility of the national government. They are, in fact, the responsibility of the sub-national, what we call the provincial governments. So each provincial government has the responsibility for managing its own natural resources and ecosystems. Now, what's interesting is that in Canada, the provincial governments don't have their own statistical capacity. So the measurement effort on ecosystems and natural resources is mostly undertaken by the National Bureau of Statistics. But a lot of the work that we do is to inform the natural resource policies of the provincial governments because they're the ones who have the policy responsibility. So there's a bit of a mismatch between where the data are needed and where they are provided in Canada. And it's a system that doesn't always meet the needs perfectly. So I don't know the situation in Indonesia who has the legal responsibility, but the closer the match between the people that have the legal responsibility for the management of the resources and the people that produce the data to help the resource managers, I think the better off you will be. So I'll leave it at that and see if there are other comments or questions, or if Juha wants to come back in and add anything to anything that I've said.
Yeah. Okay.
Maybe can I add,
Yeah.
add just quickly?
Yeah.
Yeah, on countries that are implementing accounting, so the standard is still very new, only 2 years. So it takes quite a lot of effort to get this level of undertaking going. So I don't know that any countries is doing this in a comprehensive way, but it also should be noted that maybe a good step forward is to develop some accounts, not necessarily comprehensive accounts. Start from the extent accounts, condition accounts, and go step by step, rather than trying to in a rush develop a complete set of accounts. And so this is a strategy that has been taken by many countries. There's quite a lot of interest in ecosystem accounting in developing countries. Quite a lot of progress already made before the standard. Some countries include, for instance, South Africa has been very active in this area. There are African countries, other African countries that have been working on this. Uganda, Rwanda, many others actually. Mexico, even I could probably list quite a few examples, but then in the developed world, I think one recent example that gives you a sense of the magnitude and of effort required for this comes from the US and the Biden administration, where they last year announced a natural capital strategy, and this involves actually a 15-year strategy to develop a comprehensive set of accounts to incorporate natural capital into national accounts. So that's the overall timeline, where at that point in time, 2037, I think, natural capital would be comprehensively included. At the same time, the immediate goal is to have a first set of pilot accounts already available in 2023, and then move on with a carefully staged approach, a phased approach, to learn more and pilot and make sure that then in the end, whatever is produced meets the standard of the accounts that is met by other accounts. So we want to have data that is at the level of same level of robustness as any other account in the national system of national accounts. EU will require member states to develop accounts by 2027, I think. But this will involve not a comprehensive set of accounts, but mostly the biophysical accounts. So there's quite a lot of work underway. I also know that some sub-regional, sub-national regions are developing their own accounts. We're working quite a lot with different actors in this phase. So no comprehensive accounts yet available, but lots and lots of action. And Indonesia actually has had strong capacities and efforts in the development of the framework itself, and also in the system of environmental economic accounting more generally. Thanks.
Ya, terima kasih Pak Yuha atas tambahannya. Kita akan masuk ke sesi pertanyaan yang kedua. Saya akan membacakan dan mengidentifikasi kira-kira bisa dijawab oleh siapa, tapi mungkin lebih singkat. Pertama dari Pak Alif ya. There are multiple valuation methods of an ecosystem service. Let's say provision service that can be valued with market price method, SEV method, or residual method. How to address these multiple methods? Which method is best to choose? Maybe Rob can answer this question. Next, from Naviantoro, maybe for Pak Yuha, bagaimana bisa mengoptimalkan hasil penilaian sumber daya alam dalam rangka menjaga kelestarian sumber daya alam sekaligus untuk mengoptimalkan penerimaan negara dari sektor sumber daya alam? Pertanyaan berikutnya, apakah dalam penilaian sumber daya alam dimungkinkan menggunakan automated valuation model FVM mengingat cakupan objek penilaian SDA yang sangat banyak dan luas? Dari Pak Heru mungkin bisa dijawab oleh Rob. Pertanyaan untuk Mr. Rob Smith, terima kasih atas segala penjelasan dan paparan. Di kawasan konservasi kami, Taman Nasional Teso Nilo, yang merupakan ekosistem hutan tropis dataran rendah, telah memberikan kontribusi ekonomi langsung pada masyarakat sebesar 150 miliar rupiah setiap bulan karena keberadaan kebun sawit di dalamnya. Tetapi berdasarkan valuasi ekonomi ekosistem yang masih terjaga, nilai ekologi karbon dan lain sebagainya, nilai di atas jauh lebih rendah. Bagaimana meyakinkan berbagai pihak terhadap perbedaan nilai tersebut? Model atau langkah apa yang bisa dilakukan? Dari Ibu Dewi Sri Utami, mungkin juga untuk Pak Rob, ini juga terkait dengan pertanyaan sebelumnya sebenarnya. Hi speakers, what would you consider if you do valuation for a replanting timber concession, but the company will cut it when the trees are mature? It's a timber industrial forest. Do they have a carbon credit for planting it for certain years? Dari Pak Zainul Abidin, mungkin untuk Yuha, bagaimana agar proses penilaian ekosistem dapat dilaksanakan secara efisien atau murah? Dari Pak Erwandi, mungkin untuk Rob, terkait dengan studi penilaian terhadap sumber daya alam, banyak model dan faktor yang harus dianalisis guna mendapatkan nilai yang akurat dan presisi. Pertanyaan saya, apakah dimungkinkan menyederhanakan model penilaian SDA sebagai contoh dengan model menggunakan biaya pengganti investasi? Terima kasih. Terakhir dari Pak Reza untuk Rob, it is acceptable that the value of the same ecosystem service can vary based on the location. Considering that survey-based methods like CVM and TCM are heavily dependent on the income of the respondent, I have concern that ecosystem service in low-income countries will always be undervalued because of their low willingness to pay, hence leading to less optimal conservation values. It's like a vicious cycle. Ya, mungkin bisa dijawab masing-masing panelis 3-4 menit, silakan. Dari Pak Yuha mungkin, ya silakan.
Thank you again. Those questions on the issue on how do we optimize conservation of biodiversity and economic development, natural resource use. So this is the key question that valuation tries to address. It will not optimize. Valuation itself will not optimize the decisions, but it can play a crucial role in helping arrive at economic and political decisions that take into account not just the market values arising from forests, but all the different values, all the different ecosystem services that are supported by forests, so that they can be taken into account explicitly in decisions. So as of currently, I think there's quite a lot of evidence that decisions are based mostly on market values, and we sort of sometimes say that, well, those non-market and values and conservation benefits are sort of taken into consideration in different kind of way. But unless we have good metrics for them, it's very difficult to really understand the trade-offs between, say, market benefits from forests and versus some of those more conservation-oriented decisions. So again, evaluation in and of itself will not optimize these decisions, but it can provide inputs that then helps bring these values into decision making. How can we do valuation effectively and cheaply? There is a trade-off between being effective and cheap versus being robust. And I think we found that just based on literature and the kind of working in this field for 20 some years, I think there's a crucial need for more valuation for accounting that is specifically designed for accounting and in a way that then meets the standards and needs for accounting. As of now, the current literature oftentimes does not meet those standards. And the values are significant enough for countries that I think our recommendation would be that it makes sense to invest in understanding in a meaningful and robust way what those values are. As of now, I think we have lots of different data points, quite a lot of noise, quite a lot of information, but it's sometimes hard to separate sort of noise from the signal, if I could say that. And I do think that there's an investment needed in better understanding these values. The same way we have a data infrastructure to help understand how economy is doing more generally, or how society is doing more generally. One could argue that similar sort of a data system, production system should be in place also for ecosystem services, ecosystem service values. So again, it will require an investment, but I do think that that investment is worth the cost. And we will learn as we move forward with this. It will be more effective and more probably more or less expensive as we move forward. On the issue of local income and the values, it is certainly the case that in many local ecosystem services, the value reflects the local income level, especially on the values that are very locally consumed. And but then there are also values that are more maybe taking place at the national level or maybe even at the international level. And so in the end, the job here is to develop accurate value estimates in a robust way, the same way we develop these value estimates for regular goods and services. For some goods and services, those values are quite local. It's fine, that's what we use for national accounting. But then we have goods and services like commodities, for instance, where the values are fairly global. Gold, oil, maybe a bad example here, in the context of conservation, but still these are globally traded and commodities where the values are global. So in the end, it will be probably a mixture of both local and national and international values. But I would expect that there's a great deal of variation spatially, and it can be a problem, I think, but it can still be a very helpful way of making progress, rather than not including those local even values, even if they're low, not including them now. We still want to include them even if they're relatively on the low side, so that they will at least be recognized. And then one more thing on this is that here I think it's critical to valuation both in a biophysical sense and in monetary sense. And biophysical metrics don't have the same sort of a problem of translating from one location to another. A ton of biomass is a ton of biomass no matter where you are. The same applies to water. And so sometimes developing these biophysical metrics, especially when we do them on a per household basis or per an individual basis, can help go around this issue of income determining the value, the economic value. Thank you.
Ya, terima kasih Pak Yuha. Silakan Pak Rob.
Yeah, well, thanks again, and again, thank you to everyone for this really rich set of questions. It really demonstrates the degree to which the thinking on this topic is already well advanced in Indonesia. Picking up on Juha's last point about the challenges of using willingness to pay data in contexts where the ability to pay is quite limited, and therefore willingness to pay may not actually reflect in a meaningful way the value that local people might actually place on an ecosystem. I think he's absolutely right. It's important in that instance to turn to biophysical indicators and to use those to help make the case. It's not always the case that monetary valuation is the right approach to demonstrating the value of ecosystems or protected areas. And that's why I insisted early in my talk that no matter what you end up doing in Indonesia, you have to start with the best quality biophysical statistics that you can get your hands on. And then, there are ways to construct willingness to pay surveys that can account for the fact that ability to pay is limited. We can look, for example, at willingness to pay within a household budget and envelope. So, I might have a greater ability to pay than sort of a rural person in a developing country. But as a share of my income, it may be that my willingness to pay isn't much greater than an individual in a rural part of a developing country. So you can use those kinds of relative values to get at people's interest in conservation. Let me just go back to the question list here and see what else there was.
1 menit lagi, Pak Rob.
Oh, okay. Well, if I only have 1 more minute, then I'll just sum up by saying again how much of it I've enjoyed the conversation, and you don't get questions of this depth and richness unless people have thought a lot already about the challenges. So that's as I've said already, very encouraging. I'd love to have the opportunity to dig in on these questions in more detail. All of them demand not just a couple of minutes, but actually a full day of discussion in many ways. So anyway, I'll leave it at that.
Ya, terima kasih Pak Rob dan Pak Juha. Oke, kita sudah sampai pada bagian akhir sesi tanya jawab. Kita sudah banyak membahas tentang pentingnya mengidentifikasi, mengkuantifikasi biofisik, dan memvaluasi secara moneter ya kawasan konservasi. Masih banyak PR yang harus dikerjakan untuk memasukkannya dalam statistik resmi pemerintah, seperti secara bertahap membangun setiap akun dalam SEA dan menyusun standar metode penilaian yang tentunya akan terus diperbaiki dan evolving. PR berikutnya adalah bagaimana dari statistik ini kita dapat mengoptimalkan pemanfaatannya seperti memobilisasi pendanaan konservasi dan mendukung analisis biaya manfaat untuk perluasan aktivitas ekonomi di kawasan hutan. Yang juga perlu diperhatikan adalah bagaimana membawa kuantifikasi dan angka ini dan menerjemahkannya dalam kebijakan yang tepat. Terima kasih banyak kepada para panelis, Pak Juha, Pak Rob, yang telah memberikan banyak inspirasi dan peserta yang telah sangat aktif yang menyampaikan tanggapan dan pertanyaannya. Sejauh ini kita punya 24 pertanyaan dan komentar yang disampaikan oleh peserta, dan sebagian juga belum sempat terjawab ya karena limitasi waktu. Jadi sepertinya masih banyak diperlukan diskusi ya untuk mengelaborasi lebih jauh topik ini. Saya kembalikan ke Mbak Naris untuk acara penutupan. Terima kasih. Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Waalaikumsalam warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Terima kasih banyak atas moderasinya Ibu Alin dan terima kasih banyak atas partisipasi aktif kepada 487 partisipan yang masih bertahan hingga saat ini. Sesi selanjutnya adalah penutupan yang akan disampaikan oleh Bapak David Kachan, ekonom senior dari Bank Dunia. Kepada Bapak David Kachan, waktu dan tempat kami persilakan.
Very much, Naris. Thank you, Bu Ellen, and everyone for an excellent discussion. I'm going to show one slide here. Let me start by just thanking Pak Arik for bringing us together. He's really been the driving force for making these events happen and getting this agenda moving. So thank you, Pak Arik, and then Pak Dedi for your support as well. Thank you for being here. And also to Pak Dirjen for his support. Pak Sabto, great to hear your perspectives from the National Parks angle. And then Bu Allen, thank you for your moderation. And of course to our speakers, Guha and Rob, really appreciate your insights. So to close, let me just say, what do we need at this point? You know, how do we take this forward and take this conversation into practical and real outcomes? There are a few things that we propose. First of all, I think from this conversation, there's a need to work on understanding some of the methods in a very practical way. And for that reason, what we're proposing is some training sessions around some of these tools. We heard about tools like INVEST today, which are one of the ways that quantifying some of these values can be done. So doing some clinics and some trainings on specific tools is one thing that we're proposing. Secondly, once we have value numbers, how do we then realize the values, turn those into actual flows of finance? The approach that we're looking at here is the development or supporting Indonesia in developing conservation financing instruments, conservation financing mechanisms. So that's a parallel part of this agenda. And so we'll keep you updated and involved as we work on that, facilitating some of the excellent work that's already happening by the Ministry of Finance, the Ministry of Environment and Forestry, and others. And then the third part of the puzzle, in my opinion, is the need not just to talk about it, but to do it. And for that reason, we're going to embark on something of a pilot valuation exercise, something that we've been talking about in our smaller group, which looks to map and quantify some of these values for select locations as well as Indonesia overall. So we can practice with some of these methods. And then we're going to have more sessions like this where we discuss the results, where we discuss other valuation techniques and try to bring it to you all so you can all participate in these efforts. So let me just stop there. Since our time is limited, I want to thank everyone again very much for your inputs today and really looking forward to our next session. Thank you.
Terima kasih banyak Bapak David Kachan. Untuk penutup, saya memberikan satu lagi pantun. Jalan-jalan ke hutan konservasi. Melihat kekayaan Indonesia begitu hebat. Sekian webinar penilaian hari ini. Semoga materinya bermanfaat. Sekali lagi terima kasih. Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Shalom. Om Shanti Shanti Om. Namo Buddhaya. Salam kebajikan.
Thank you, David. Terima kasih, Mbak Naris. Terima kasih semuanya, Mbak Alin.
Terima kasih, Bapak dan Ibu.
Terima kasih semuanya.
Rob.
Terima kasih Bapak
Thank you
sekalian.
for all.
Sangat
Thank you
bergizi.
for all.
Bye-bye.
Terima kasih. Thank you.
Sekalian.
Thank you. Thank you.
Terima
kasih semua. Izin live.
Ya, terima kasih untuk Bapak.
Salam
Ibu.
sehat. Pak Arik, sehat selalu Pak.
Amin, terima kasih.
Setiawan, Pak.
Mas Setiawan, ya. Terima kasih Mas Setiawan.
Nuhun Pak
Siap,
Arik.
sampai ketemu.
Iya, monggo, monggo.
Tunggu seksi berikutnya, webinar
Siap,
berikutnya.
ditunggu sesi berikutnya nanti.
Matur suwun Pak Zuha, Pak Rob.
Mungkin Pak Ketua.
Terima kasih, Pak.
Terima kasih Pak Ketum.
Terima
Terima kasih Pak Arik, Bapak Ibu. Izin live, terima kasih.
Izin live semuanya.
Mas Sabto, makasih Mas Sabto. Ji. Mas Sabto Haji Prabowo. Ji.
Ditunggu kunjungannya ke TNGGP Pak Arik.
Siap, siap. Nanti satu waktu ke sana Mas. Siap, makasih. Ini luar biasa ini. Luar biasa. Mbak Jenny, makasih Mbak Jenny.
Bu Amin, Miss Mbak Wocok kabeh. Bar Pak. Ning Mbak ning gone MEP ketemu Mbak Lina.
Terima kasih Pak Direktur. Terima kasih Mas Daniel Tobing. Terima kasih.
Makasih Pak Arik, izin pamit Bapak.
Iya Mas Kiki, makasih. Sumanun, makasih semuanya.
Terima kasih, izin live ya Pak Arik.
Ya, monggo Pak Yati. Siap, siap. Terima kasih semua.
Terima kasih Pak Direktur.
Sembah nuwun, dari Papua, Mas Santoso, siap. Luar biasa.
Terima kasih Pak Arik, super.
Iya Pak Ketum, nanti kita ini PR-nya banyak Pak Ketum.
Iya.
Siap pokoknya Pak. Ini menjalankan amanah dari jenengan juga ini Mas. Banyak yang nanti dilakukan gitu.
Siap, siap.
Mbak Naris, masih ada Mbak Naris?
Masih ada, Pak.
Ya, Mbak.
Kenapa?
Enggak, nanti untuk kita rencana lanjutan itu berarti kurang lebih masih berapa minggu lagi ke depan ya nanti atau bulan apa nanti ya. Tapi yang nanti yang rencana kita akan buat itu tulisan-tulisan itu mungkin kita akan lakukan nanti ya Pak ya. Nanti mungkin
Iya.
posisi David masih di Jakarta sampai kapan?
Saya kebetulan mau wisuda, Pak. Jadi lagi sedang tidak di Jakarta, sedang di Inggris. Tapi
Di Inggris?
iya.
Wow, keren, luar biasa, luar biasa. Ya, sukses ya wisudanya ya kalau gitu ya. Selamat ya, congratulations ya Mbak Naris ya. Ya
Banyak,
nanti
Pak.
kita sambung lagi kontak-kontaknya. Makasih buat semuanya. Izin kalau gitu mau live. Makasih.
Ya, terima kasih banyak Pak Arik dan semuanya.
Sukses,
Sampai
luar
bertemu.
biasa, luar biasa sampai 500. Keren, keren. Makasih.
Ya.